Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. We built a simple starter project with React Native in the last video, and today we're going to build a simple messaging/posting app. Let's take a quick tour of the app and see what you'll be building. The app will display a list of posts or messages. Users can add new messages through a pop-up Modal form, and also delete them by clicking a trash icon. Planning is always crucial when building an app, but even more so when you're building a mobile app. The drawing represents the component structure of this app. The app component will be the parent to a button component and a component to display all message items, which are its child components. The button component, when pressed, will display a modal with an input field. React for the DOM or mobile follows the same component structure. Unlike when using React.js for the DOM, which uses HTML tags, React Native has special components given to us like view or text, for which it translates to instructions that the React Native platforms understand. The React Native components you are working with are compiled to real native elements. It's also important to note that there is no CSS for styling in React Native, only CSS-looking syntax that is just more JavaScript. We're going to use the app we built in the last video as a skeleton. Inside the view where we were displaying a message, let's replace that with a text input that we're going to import from React Native. We're going to add a placeholder property so that we can see exactly where our input is displayed. Unlike what you would think of as a traditional input in the DOM, there are no borders in a text input. We're also going to add a style property with styles that will be on a class that we'll call input. Let's start creating those styles. To make it look like a more traditional input, we'll give it a border. Let's make it have a width of 1 and we'll do a light gray color. I don't like the sharp edges, so I'm going to give it a radius of 5. Let's do some padding and a width of 80%. It definitely seems to work, but the default on text inputs in React Native is to auto-capitalize, which you may or may not want. I don't want this behavior, so let's look at the docs and see how we can turn it off. Okay, so we need to set the property of auto-capitalize to none. Let's find our text input, and we're just going to add auto-capitalize equal to the string of none. That looks like it did the trick. Okay, let's hook up the input to the message state. To do this, we'll add the value property and set it equal to the message. Next, we need an onChange method, and in React Native, it's called onChangeText. The callback function will receive the text that's being typed in by the user. We can use a function, which we can create in a sec, called messageinputHandler. In messageinputHandler, we'll receive the entered text and simply use the setMessage to update the message. Let's console log it to make sure it's working as expected. Now that we have that working, let's head over to Json Placeholder, which is the mock API we're going to use to get a list of messages. We'll be using a fetch call similar to this, but instead of post, we'll be using comments. Click on comments and let's take a look. We can see that there's several properties, but for our purposes, we only care about the ID and the body. Let's head on back to app.js, import useEffect, and now in useEffect, with an empty dependency array because we only want it to run once, we'll paste in our code from Json Placeholder. Let's modify the URL to say comments. Json Placeholder gives us a convenient console log, and if we look in the terminal, we're getting exactly what we expected. Next, let's create a piece of state that we're going to call messages, and of course a setter function setMessages. And we can initialize that to an empty array, and now we can replace our console log with setMessages. Let's add a view with a background color of red. I'll be using several background colors in this tutorial because it's helpful when visualizing the components and how they're rendering. And we can just map over the messages. In the return statement, let's add some text. To display text, we need a text tag. We're going to add some styles right away. Padding of 5, a margin top of 10. And like we said, we're going to use the message body within this tag. Oh, I just noticed I used curly braces instead of parentheses, so we need a return statement. Also, let's not forget the key, and for this we can just use the message ID. This is the typical way you would do this in a web app, but in React Native, when a list is longer than the screen, it will not scroll automatically. Luckily, React Native gives us a couple components to handle this very thing. Let's take a look at the React Native documentation to find these components. The first component we're going to take a look at and use is scroll view. The React Native docs gives you some great examples, such as this one. As you can see, the text exceeds the screen length, but you're able to scroll. Scroll view is used almost exactly like a view component. Of course, we have to import it from React Native. And now let's replace the regular view with a scroll view. So right now the component is taking over the whole screen. This is obviously not what we want. So let's add some padding to the container to clear the status bar. Let's give the container a background color so that we can clearly see what space each component is taking. Our scroll view and input seem to both be working. Let's change up the styles a bit on the text component temporarily, and we will call this list container. We'll also give it a background color, some horizontal and vertical padding. Scroll view works, but it loads all the items when the component renders. This isn't ideal for super long lists. A better component also by React Native is flat list. Flat list only renders what's on the screen, improving performance and making it ideal for really long lists. Let's head to the docs again and take a look at it. In this example, we have a data array. If we take a look at the return, flat list has some additional properties. Let's replace scroll view with flat list. Flat list, unlike scroll view, is a self-closing tag. We don't need to do any extra mapping since flat list gives you a property to handle that. First, we can start by adding a key to each item rendered. Key extractor gives you access to the item and its index. For now, we'll just use the index and coerce it to a string. We can add the data property that takes the list you want to render, and render item, which takes a function which gives you access to the item data. In this function, we're going to start with a view. We can add a class called listItem, which we'll create in a second. In a text component, we'll just display the comment body, and for this we need to access the item and then the body. We need to change the curly braces to parentheses so that we don't have to add a return statement. Let's create our list item class. We'll start off with a padding of 10, a margin vertical of 5, and we can give them a background color of white. In the flat list style property, let's replace the hard-coded red background with styles.listContainer. That looks pretty good, but let's add a border radius to round out the corners a little bit. Everything seems to be working as expected. I think it's time for a refactor. Let's break out the message item into its own component. Let's start by creating a folder called components. And within that folder, we'll create a file called message item. Let's do our usual import of React. And from React Native, we're going to import view, text, and style sheet. We're going to export the function as a default. And we know that we're going to receive props, so let's add them to the argument list now. And then of course we can't forget our return statement. Let's create our styles constant by calling the create method on stylesheet, and for now we'll just leave it as an empty object. Off of props, we'll be receiving message text and message ID. In the return statement, we'll add a view with list item styles, which we can copy over from app.js. In app.js, we can replace what we have in render item to be our new component. We will of course have to pass a prop of message text and message ID, which we've already named in the receiving component. Also at the top of your file, don't forget to import message item component. So it's successfully rendering out items, but we haven't added any content in the message item. In message item, let's add another view, and we'll add a style property which we'll make on styles called list header. This will contain a header with a text component. We'll use this to display our message ID as our title. We'll want to bold the text, and let's increase the font size to 20. In a second text component outside of the list header view, we'll just render message text. It's definitely starting to look good, but the cards look a little bit flat. Let's add a little bit of three-dimensional depth using shadows. For this, we're going to have to add a few styles. Shadow color, which we'll make black. Shadow offset with a width of 0 and a height of 2. Shadow radius of 6. And let's do an opacity of 0.25. The shadow definitely looks good, but I feel like the cards are a little bit close together. Let's add some more vertical margin. Let's do a hard reload to make sure everything is rendering out properly and we're using the most updated code. Let's head back to app.js and remove the background color. In components, let's create a new file to hold our message input form. As usual, we're going to do the boilerplate stuff we always do. We're going to add an import for React, and we know we're going to use useState, so let's just import it now. From React Native, we'll import text input, stylesheet, and view. We're going to export the function as default. We can cut and paste the message state we already created from app.js into our newly created component. We can also cut the text input from app.js, and in the new component, let's add a return statement and paste it in. We can wrap the input in a view with some styles which we can call form container. We can create a constant variable called styles with the help of stylesheet.create again. And again, we'll head over to app.js to cut out the styles that we've already created. Once pasted in, we should see the styles reflected. But first, we have to go back to app.js and import the new message input. At the top of the file, we'll just add that after our other imports. In the return statement, let's add message input where our old input used to live. We can also cut out message input handler since that will be handled within the message input component. Oh, it seems I might have a typo. Yep, I forgot an S at the end of styles. That's better. Inside of our styles, let's add form container. And once again, we'll add a background color to help guide us when styling. We're going to add a flex of 1, which we'll also remove in a second, a justify content, Let's do center. And we'll also align the content center. We're going to need some margin at the bottom, and we'll do 20 for that, and some padding all around, and we'll do 10 for that. Let's comment out the flex one since we won't be needing that till we get to the modal portion of this tutorial. We want to make sure that the form container takes up 100% of the width, and right now we'll give it kind of an arbitrary height at 200. So it seems that the input is working as normal, but we still have a long way to go with styling, and we have to add buttons. So let's import a button from React Native. And in our return statement, we'll actually create two buttons. One button will do a title of add, and another button will do a title of cancel. Let's wrap the two buttons with a view, and we'll add a style property that we'll create in a second called actions. In styles, let's add our action key. I don't want the buttons to be stacked. Instead, I want them side by side. So let's start by changing the flex direction to row. For justify content, we'll use space evenly, and we'll make the whole thing take up a width of 80%. Let's also add some styles to the button. For now, we're going to set a width of 40%. Let's make sure to add a style prop to both buttons with our newly created styles. And I'm noticing that the buttons are really similar, so let's head over to Components and create a new file called Custom Button. In Custom Button, we'll do the usual, import React from React, and we'll import touchable opacity, view, text, style sheet from React Native. We're going to export the function as a default called custom button, and we'll be for sure receiving props, so let's add it as an argument. Off of props, we're going to deconstruct children. In our return statement, let's add touchable opacity, for now with an on press that just logs pressed. Nested inside, we'll add a view, and let's add another background color again. We'll definitely want some text for the title of the button, so let's add a text component with a style prop. Let's create our styles using stylesheet.create. Okay, now in the style prop, we'll just do styles.text, which we'll create in a minute. And within the text tags, we're just going to render out the children. Back in message input, we can start by removing the button from React Native import, since we won't be using that anymore. And we can import our custom button from our components. Now let's replace button with custom button. And remember, it's not a self-closing tag. So let's make that adjustment. And here, add and cancel will be considered the children in our custom button component, which we deconstructed off of props. I think that's something that would be important to the customizability of a reusable button would be for it to be able to take a color as a prop. So let's deconstruct color off of props, and we'll remove the hard-coded blue and change that for color. And now within message input, we'll add a color property, add will be blue, and cancel will be red. In custom button, let's get some styles going so that these start looking a little bit more like buttons. I think it would look good to have a slight shadow, a lot like the cards that we've already created. We can copy over most of the styles from message item. Let's add some vertical padding, we'll do 15, and horizontal padding of 20. To stay consistent, we'll do a border radius of 5. Elevation is only really necessary to create shadow effects on Android devices. It'll make no difference in our iOS emulator. Let's add the button style to our view, and we can't forget to spread them since we already have an object property defined. Alright, let's take care of the button text. First, we'll make the text color white. Let's also center the text in the vertical and horizontal directions. I think we should also bold it. And let's bump up the font to 18. Looks like it's working, and they're looking much better. Let's add a function to the message input that handles the add button press. And we can call it add message handler. For now in the body, we will just add the setter function, but eventually we will also use this function to clear the input. In our first custom button, let's pass a prop called onPress, which will contain the add message handler. In add message handler, let's call a function that we will eventually create called prependMessage. This will be coming from app.js, so let's deconstruct it off of props. Back in app.js, let's create prependMessage, which of course takes the message, and we will use setMessages in the function form, which will return an array with the newly created message as the first item at index 0. Since our user does not provide an ID, we'll create one using mathRandom and mathRound. We will also add an M to the beginning of our IDs so that we can differentiate from the messages coming from Json Placeholder. The body will simply be the message. We also need to spread the previous messages. We can head down to our return statement, find message input, and add prependMessage as a prop. In custom button, we need to make sure to deconstruct the onPress from the props. And now we will remove the console log and pass in the onPress function coming from the parent component. And we should probably make sure that it's working. And it is. It's time to refactor the form in a Modal component. We can head to the React Native docs on Modal. This one looks like what we want. In message input, let's import the Modal component from React Native. We can add it to our return statement and add the visible prop that we saw from the docs, and we'll set that to visible, which is a variable we'll be creating really soon. We'll add a style property with some styles that we'll create on Modal. We'll also add the animation type as slide. Let's not forget to add the closing tag, and let's add visible to the props that will be coming from the parent. We can now uncomment the flex1 property in the styles, and we can just remove the height of 100. We'll reduce the width of the input to 80%, and we'll fix another typo that I made. It's not align content, it's align items. Wow, I'm forgetting S's all over the place. So it's actions and not action. Let's add a little bit of margin bottom to the input so that the buttons aren't sitting right up against the input. And now back in app.js, we'll make sure to add the visible prop that we're passing down to message input. We're going to need to create a piece of state to handle our modal open and closing. So we'll call it isModalOpen and set isModalOpen, and we'll initialize it to false. Now we can set visible to isModalOpen, and since we set it as false, the modal is of course not showing. We'll add a button which will open the modal, and we'll title it, "What Are You Thinking?" For this button's onPress, we will set isModalOpen to true using the setter function. You may have guessed that we also need a function to close the modal. We'll call that closeModal, and in the body of this function, we'll set isModalOpen to false. We're also going to need to pass close modal to message input, and this will be associated to the on press of the cancel custom button. Let's make sure that we're receiving close modal from the props, and let's test this out a little. In add message handler, we need to pass set message and empty string. And in prepend message, which is in app.js, let's set the modal to false once it's been added to the list. And there you go, it seems to be working. Our last order of business is to be able to delete messages. For this, we're going to use the touchable opacity from React Native. The touchable opacity will go inside of our header, right under the text. And for now, we'll just console.log delete when pressed. One of the best things about using Expo is that you have access to lots of icon packs. In the Expo icon documentation, let's search for trash, and it's as simple as copying the import statement and the tag. They even give you a copy button to do so. Our list header, let's set display to flex, and then flex direction to row. We're also going to justify the content with space in between so that the trash icon sits at the very right corner of the card. Off of props, let's receive an onDelete function, which we'll create in a little bit, and pass it to our onPress in touchable opacity. In app, let's create onDelete and make sure it's receiving the message ID. We're going to use set messages again in the function form, receiving the previous messages, but this time instead we're going to use filter, which takes a function that will allow you access to each element in the array. And there we can compare whether or not the message ID matches the ID of the current item. Now we can pass the onDelete function to the message item component. And let's make sure to add a return statement to our set messages function. We can now remove the form container background color and take a look at the app. If you've been coding along, you should feel really proud of yourself. Although this app is not really full-featured, we've set the groundwork to some of the most important principles to build React Native apps. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.